Still on elections, the topic is attacks on voting machines. Senator and presidential pre-candidate Flávio Bolsonaro from the PL party attacked the electronic voting machines with accusations that have already been denied by the Superior Electoral Court. Flávio was in a meeting with diplomats and ambassadors in Brasilia. He is repeating the episode involving his father, Jair Bolsonaro, in July 2022.
Well, as I said, today former President Jair Bolsonaro became ineligible after a meeting with the ambassadors, someone who was concerned about the transparency and security of our electoral system and was simply expressing his concerns so that the ambassadors could take those concerns back to their countries. And today, just a few days ago, coincidentally, there was a report from the American government about suspicions of fraud in the electronic electoral process, especially in Venezuela, including using documentation from the American intelligence service itself, the CIA, pointing out the possibility of vulnerability in the electronic voting system. And one of the suspicions is that a company called Smartmatic of Venezuelan origin is involved. One of the suspicions is that there was programming to alter the votes in that country in the 2010 elections, if I'm not mistaken. No, I'm sorry, it's intelligence data from 2020 in the elections in Venezuela. The elections under suspicion that are mentioned in the CIA reports are from 2012. I won't go into more details, but just to put it on record that many of the machines used in Brazilian elections are from the same origin as that Venezuelan company. So the request I'm making to everyone here, and I'm not questioning the Brazilian voting system, but that all countries send as many observers as possible to our elections as they always do. And also people who have knowledge about this technology and how Brazil can have safer and more transparent elections.
The event was held today by the Novo Sela Communication Agency. In 2022, the TSE debunked the claim that Brazilian voting machines had the same origin as the machines from the Venezuelan company Smartmatic. We are waiting for a new position, a new response from the court regarding purchases after the year 2022.
We have some other news from this election period here, Caio. The president of the PL, Valdemar Costa Neto, said this Tuesday in an interview with Bastidor and CNN that the senator and presidential pre-candidate Flávio Bolsonaro was not prepared for the race. He also said that the party is now working to structure the project from this point on.
Flávio was not prepared to be a candidate, so he was chosen by Bolsonaro. He hadn't built a campaign structure. He hadn't done any previous work to run for president. And he was chosen. Bolsonaro chose Flávio, and now we are finally making progress on this matter. And I'm going to have a meeting this afternoon with Flávio. I'm going to have a meeting with Flávio and Rogério Marinho to discuss this. We're going to talk. We're talking with the other parties.
Caio, in that same interview for Bastidores, Valdemar Costa Neto talked about Senator Teresa Cristina. Yesterday, we talked a lot about her here, one of the names considered for the vice spot on Senator Flávio Bolsonaro's ticket. But the president of the PL has already said that the senator has other plans.
Yeah, we mentioned yesterday that there would be this meeting. Valdemar met with Teresa in the morning, and then Valdemar went to our studio in Brasilia, and he made these statements because he had just finished talking to her. She was approached to be the vice candidate alongside Flávio, and she said that her intention is to become president of the Senate, right? So she was already ruled out, even though she was the main name that Flávio and the PL were working with, first because she's a woman, and second because she would bring major agribusiness support to the campaign, agribusiness. She was very close to Jair, but not that close to Flávio. So there was also this idea of bringing this sector of the economy closer to the campaign, not to mention the political strength she represents, especially the PP. She is from Ciro Nogueira's PP and would link Ciro Nogueira's party to Flávio's campaign. But then, with this project discarded, we would now bet on putting a lot of pressure on the Republicanos party, which also tends to free up all the parties from the Centrão Márcio. They don't want to form a coalition with anyone, not with Lula and not with Flávio. This is part of a strategy. First, you don't know who's going to win. So if you tie yourself to someone and later on you lose, it's bad. We focus heavily on the presidential election, but we must also closely watch the National Congress. And these parties are taking the billions in resources, in some cases that they have from the party fund and the electoral fund, to focus on the election for deputies and senators. So if you have a vice presidential candidate or even a presidential candidate, you have to take money from the campaigns for deputies and senators to put into that race for the executive branch, which might end up losing, right? So we're focusing a lot of resources on the National Congress. That's the situation. That statement from Valdemar saying that Flávio wasn't prepared, I think it was more his way of justifying this rejection by the Centrão parties to formally close ranks and form a coalition with Flávio Bolsonaro. Now, attention is on the Republicanos party, featuring Daniela Marques, former Caixa Econômica Federal president and close ally of Paulo Guedes. It would be a name that would have limited appeal among economic players.
The federal police executed a search and seizure warrant against lobbyist Antonio Carlos Camilón Tunis, known as the bald guy from INSS, during a new phase of Operation Sem Desconto. This Tuesday, investigators seized 3 luxury cars at an address in Brasilia, including an Audi R8 V10 and a BMW M5. The vehicles have varying prices and can reach around 2 million reais in the pre-owned or used car markets. The measure was authorized by the Federal Supreme Court, and according to the federal police, its main goal is to strip the bald man from the INSS of assets, who was identified as one of the main operators of the investigated scheme. In a statement sent to Mirel Pinheiro's column here at Metropolis, Antonio Carlos's defense said that in October of last year, they reported the existence of vehicles that had not been seized despite the court order.
Minister Flávio Dino from the Federal Supreme Court is reviewing the new statements submitted by the Chamber of Deputies regarding the process of allocating parliamentary amendments. The Chamber states that all committee amendments followed the internal regulations and were approved by the committees and caucuses before being sent to the government.
In an interview with Central de Noticias here at SBT News, the president of the PL, Valdemar Costa Neto, said that he considers it natural for party leaders to participate in the designation of parliamentary amendments. According to him, part of these designations is recorded in writing after discussions with party leaders and federal deputies. Let's go to Brasilia then to talk to reporter João Gabriel Freitas. João, which parties have already provided explanations to the Supreme Court about the process of designating amendments?
Look, as you mentioned, Celso, the PL was one of them, and 3 other parties have already spoken out. PSDB, MDB, and PSD have already responded to this request for clarification from Minister Flávio Dino on the matter, specifically about the allocation of parliamentary amendment funds, and especially the role that the national party leaders play in this type of resource allocation. Starting with the most recent statement from PSDB, which said it is unaware of any kind of fixed quota or reserve destined for the party's presidency in this regard concerning the allocation of resources from parliamentary amendments. The national president of MDB, Federal Deputy Baleia Rossi, also made a statement. He said in response to the Federal Supreme Court that, as the national president of the party, he neither participates in nor authorizes any kind of decision-making regarding the allocation of resources from parliamentary amendments. In fact, in a part of what MDB said in response to the Supreme Federal Court, the party stated the following quote, "Within the MDB, the national presidency does not have formally or informally quotas, reserves, financial limits, or any mechanism of its own for distributing budget amendments." End quote. In these statements to the Supreme Federal Court, Gilberto Kassab, national president of the PSD, also said that at no time during his tenure leading the party, there, as a leader, as the national president of the PSD, he never even considered exerting influence over the decision-making regarding the allocation of resources from budget amendments. In fact, in a section of the PSD's response to the Supreme Federal Court, the party says the following, quote, "In the case of the Social Democratic Party, PSD, the guidance to its respective leaders is for absolute respect for the procedural rules of the legislative bodies regarding the lawful distribution of budget amendments." End quote. I quoted and highlighted this specific part of what the PSD said about the role of the legislative bodies and the party's respect for each institution. Because, as you pointed out, the Chamber of Deputies was one of those institutions that spoke out. Through the Chamber's legal counsel, the institution here in the National Congress said that these committee budget amendments were voted on. They were then reviewed by the committees and authorized through votes cast by the parliamentarians. In a section of the statement released by the House's legal counsel, it says the following quote, The House's legal counsel argues that the designated beneficiaries are the same as those who actually received the funds, which would rule out the characterization of misappropriation of public funds. End quote. Remember that this series of statements is being made within the scope of the ADPF 854, a lengthy process, whose rapporteur, Justice Flávio Dino, has been trying to implement a series of measures to bring more transparency to parliamentary amendments of various types since 2020 and also in 2022 in this effort to bring more transparency to the allocation of resources from parliamentary amendments. In this specific case, we are talking about parliamentary committee amendments. Now, if I talk about these statements, as you mentioned, the national president of the PL, Valdemar, also made a statement. Costa Neto, who in an interview with SBT News earlier today said that he does not have a decision-making role in this allocation of resources. Here is a brief excerpt from the national president of the PL. Let's listen.
That's more than natural because I have a national perspective. They don't. The congressman only has a viewpoint within his state. And since there are these committee funds, which are not decided by the committee chairman we appoint, he simply decides who they go to. He discusses it with the party, discusses it with the leader, because the one who signs this is the leader. The leader is the one who signs. He is the one responsible for forwarding these amendments. I don't have a quota. I understand that Minister Flávio Dino took this action thinking, based on the federal police's statement, that I had a special quota for myself. I never had and never needed that quota. The big problem, as I understand it, is that Flávio Dino was imagining, that Minister Flávio Dino was imagining that I had a quota. That doesn't exist. I've never had it.